Speaking Cinema with Andrew Schwarz.
Welcome to the Speaking Cinema podcast. This is a special episode on David Lynch, our dear beloved director, father, friend, how we loved him so. So we wanted to do something that was in service to him. And we have two very, very special guests that are joining me today that have been guests on the podcast before several times, and they're sort of originals and great friends and colleagues of mine. And I'll introduce them in just a second, but I just want to say that I have them here because we all share an extreme fondness and admiration and mutual respect for this very special filmmaker who we just very recently lost in this January of 2025. So we wanted to say some kind words to him and share what we are going through and what we are processing in the light of this terrible loss. And also just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of just how influential this guy was for us. And it's just a rare thing that we get together and talk about a filmmaker's true distilled importance. And I think that that's what we are here to do today. So to do that with me, I have, you just heard him on that last episode, episode 1 of season 3, about Heathers. Here we've got Adam Seccafico, the writer and director. Adam, thank you for joining us.
It's nice to see you again, old friend.
Oh, I already miss his crazy voice. You too, buddy. You too. It just becomes a John McCain impression for me. Speaking of Johns, our original, returning to us, you last saw him on the last episode, the final episode of season 2, which was on Spike Jonze's Her. This is Jon Bewley, also a writer, director, and cinematographer, and producer, and so on. John, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, buddy. Now let's try that again and make it good.
Yeah, Stonehouse's was really good.
Stonehouse is spot on.
I was really taken aback by how good Stonehouse was. We were doing Blue Velvet, and he did it out of nowhere and just walloped me. But anyway, what I'd like to start off with, guys, is we always talk about takes here on films, which is our own personal ideas of significance and the meaning of the movies. Well, here we're talking about an individual, a man that has really done so much to move so many and to inspire so many in such a unique way. There's this kind of, I think I might have mentioned it in Blue Velvet, there's this, not an adage, but there's something I've heard someone say of Lynch, that you can ask 6 different people about what any of what his movies are about, and you'll get 6 completely different answers. So instead of doing a take on the movie, I want to begin with your take on the human being. Basically, the question is, what is your take on Lynch? More specifically, why is he so well known to be so different? Okay, and what separates this guy for you personally from every other filmmaker? We have seen so many films, and whether you're listening out there, you're a junkie or not, there's so many filmmakers out there and films to watch. We've seen so many films from so many different kinds of people across time. And this is one of those people that landed in the culture so hard, and he's so ingrained in what it means for a movie to be cinematic, what it means for a movie to have an effect on the viewer in such a strong way. What does this guy mean to you? I'm going to start with you, Adam. Individually, as a person, and how has that affected you? What's your take on David Lynch in general?
David Lynch was David Lynch. As far as I think how he resonated with an audience was nobody made movies like him. Many tried. There's been many imitators over the years, but Lynch brought something that was uniquely his. And while I could never aspire to be exactly like him as a filmmaker, he's too out there. he taught me how important it is to have your own voice as a filmmaker. In a way, because I think you've compared him to a father figure. I never saw him as a father figure. I saw him more as a grandfather figure. Because your father, you end up being more like, inadvertently or otherwise, but your grandfather is like a parental figure, but there's a degree of separation. You don't see him all the time, but they're always there out in the ether. And plus, I can picture David Lynch going, I have a shiny quarter for the young man who can help get the bags out of the car. Or, let me tell you a story about the time I went to war with Dino De Laurentiis over the film Dune. But the point,
what makes him a
being,
grandfather and not a father? Just real quick.
that degree of separation. I'm talking me specifically as a filmmaker. Mm-hmm. There was always something that was ethereal. I couldn't reach out and quite touch what he made emotionally, like maybe I should have. I could do that for The Man, arguably, because he was so out there with interviews, and he was always kind of culturally always out there. But the films were always more mysterious. I couldn't love them like I could love, Kevin Smith or Quentin Tarantino or Edgar Wright or any of those guys. But of those guys I couldn't touch, David Lynch, Terrence Malick, Stanley Kubrick, Lynch always was more warm as a figure compared to those other two for me, personally. I could interact with him even if I couldn't quite get there with the movies. The movies were always just so off-center that I couldn't copy or I couldn't learn directly, but I can always enjoy and I can always know that there's a true artist behind them.
Very nice. John, what's your take on David Lynch, the human being, as he relates to you personally?
I kind of look at David Lynch as both a filmmaker and a man who is mask off. I'm sure he had his public and private persona like most people do, but I just get this feeling from the material that I see and from some of the outpouring of love that I had seen from people like Naomi Watts, Kyle MacLachlan, Laura Dern's beautiful eulogy, which I read last night, and there was an actress who was cast in Twin Peaks: The Return who thought she was going to be an extra, and she ended up being an actual significant part. And everybody, from what they described about him, he seemed like what you saw was what you were getting. And there is this warmth to him. There is a pragmatism to him as well. He was an intelligent businessman, but he used a business acumen that he had when he would talk about doing commercials because they paid him, and also doing the kind of art that he did. But for me, there's two moments in particular that really stand out to me, and it's funny because they are, I think both moments would be considered kind of smaller moments, but there's a moment where he's talking about watching a film on your cell phone, and I think he says something along the lines of like, understanding what you're seeing and understanding what you're watching on a screen that small is impossible. Like, get a grip, get a clue. And it didn't feel like an old man yelling at the clouds, like a lot of other filmmakers kind of sound like when they say, oh, you can't watch it on an iPad, it's not how it's supposed to be seen. There's always this external, or like it is an internal kind of the thing, like you won't be able to appreciate what I did or what I was doing. And Lynch came off more like you just won't get the full appreciation of what you're watching. You're going to better understand it when you see it in the means it was meant to be made. But there wasn't there wasn't an ego to it when I heard it. It just felt very matter of fact.
There's some kind of a humility in there.
Yeah, there's a humility in there. And then the other moment that stands out to me is a moment I saw trending on social media recently, I lied. There's two additional ones. So there's this little small moment where somebody's handing him a cup of coffee, and he says, "Look at that! It's a beautiful cup of coffee." And there's a man who's just in the middle of an interview willing to point out something so small as a cup of coffee. And as somebody who also enjoys coffee myself, we do kind of get a little culty about coffee sometimes, but there is beauty in the small moments, and it extends to him doing the weather reports that he would do over the internet. But I think the other moment too that really stands out is when he was doing Twin Peaks: The Return, and there's a behind the scenes bit where he's giving Naomi Watts a note, and he says, "Slap me." And so she gives him a little pat on the cheek, and he just gets really stern. He's like, "No, you're pissed off. Slap me. I want you to slap me." And you just hear Naomi Watts kind of like, her voice gets really soft, and it almost like turns into this almost childlike crumble, like, no, you are like a parent figure to me. I don't want to hit you. And you just hear her softly say, "But I don't want to." And you just watch him shift from like really stern and like in a director mode, and he just crumbles and just goes, "Oh, sweetheart," and puts his arm around her, and they both start laughing. And that, all of those little moments to me, along with what I had seen in his masterclass, to just bring that all full circle, I think what we saw was what we got, and we got somebody who was pragmatic, somebody who was deeply intelligent, but somebody who was incredibly warm. And he saw how complex the world is, but he knew that if you approached it with a warmth, that things would be better.
I mean, if I can jump in, he always had that reputation early on as being somebody who, oh my God, this horrible person that would make these great actors do these terrible things on screen, and why would he do that? But yet, how many of those actors, to John's point, came out and eulogized him as beautifully as they did? Because while sure there was that, kind of darker image that we all kind of had of Lynch at one point, he was such a warm human being, and they would totally go to war for that man. And they wouldn't have felt the way they felt if he hadn't been that emotionally available to them as well as a director, which I think people tend to overlook.
Well, and I think there's, to go off of your point, Adam, he would have these actors go through some of these horrible things in the way that, like, Robert Ebert, talked about Blue Velvet in particular and what Isabella Rossellini had to do for that film. But Rossellini came to his defense almost immediately. And I agree with you. I think that for the darkness that he put his actors through, I think there's a difference. And I think that his actors felt incredibly safe. Yeah, Laura Dern had a no nudity clause from what I remember reading, but she chose to break that for Wild at Heart. And I can only imagine she broke that for Wild at Heart because she felt comfortable. Like, she felt that comfortable and safe with David to do anything that the script called for. There is a level of trust there when you're willing to do that, especially as a woman in your either late 20s or early 30s.
I think it was even younger than that. I think it was definitely early 20s at that point, because she was so young in Blue Velvet.
Yeah, and Wild at Heart was only a couple of years later.
Yeah.
Yes. So we're talking about a very, very young woman here.
Because Wild at Heart was 89, right?
90.
90.
They shot it, so they probably shot it in 89.
Yeah, she would have been like 20 or 21.
Right. So we're talking about a man that
shot congruently with Twin Peaks, actually.
Yeah.
That's why so much crossover.
Which is wild. But yeah, so I guess we're talking about a man who was extremely sensitive to and with his actors. Yeah. Which in and of itself is very special, right? Because you also have actors talking about directors like, they're so brilliant, they're so nice, they treated me so well, because, that's what the actors should do for their careers and so on. And that's just very, common, but there you can tell when these actors are either with Lynch or even without him, talking about him. You can tell that these people have long-lasting relationships with him, and they're very special relationships. And of course, they keep recurring in his movies. So that's how you know an actor is like genuine, when they're saying very, very good and charitable things about someone. So what I was going to say was, not to undercut anything that you guys just said, because it's all good and it all makes sense. But I just want to say that everything that you guys said, I think, could be said about other people. You know, Adam said that Lynch was warm. You know, John said that he had a really good relationship with his actors and he was very intuitive.
But I also said he's very mask off.
Yes, he's very mask off.
And that is the thing I'd like to point out, because I don't think many other whenever I've seen an interview with another filmmaker, I think we get a glimpse into who they are. But I do think that most, and I said actor, I meant director, I think there's a lot of filmmakers out there that we are still ultimately seeing, you know, a more PR friendly version of themselves.
Yeah.
And I think based on the type of films that Lynch made and the type of man that he is, I don't really feel like we were getting any sort of particularly PR crafted personality.
Yeah, no, he was just the man unmasked, for sure.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is, I think it's a testament to his work and his art and his presence in just the universe and how strong it is. It's so difficult to describe what it is that makes him a rock star and sets him apart. And the beautiful thing about that is that you just need to watch.
Yeah.
You need to experience the work. We can sit here all day and I can ask you boring interview questions like, so what was your favorite David Lynch movie? Why did you like this man? You know, I purposely started out with one of those so I can kind of get into this, because knowing Lynch, he would probably just say, well, what the fuck is the point of a stupid ass question like that? Ask me a real goddamn question, you know, or I'll never come back here again, you know? So, and I just want to get into that. Like, you're right, mask off. But it's the work, I think, itself explains who and how he was, right? Like, you can say things like dark, dismal, romantic, and yet very hard to watch. You know, you can say things like a fascination with violence, a fascination with creepiness, nightmarish. You can say all of these tags, these keywords, but right, somehow none of that stuff actually gets to the core of why he was different than any other artist that you could say, that you could tag the same exact way. Adam, I see you thinking, why this is what I wanted to ask. Why do you think that his combination of all those things, in the way that he did them, why is that the version that has resonated with the culture and not, I mean, Buñuel was a great director. Guy Madden is a great director. You know, there are so many, like, other surrealists, great directors. Why this guy's work, and not just once, it's not a one-hit wonder. It's one after the other, delivering and delivering and delivering in tone and style. Why does this guy break through, and why is he a perennial figure?
I think firstly, and I'll answer the pragmatic thing first, was there were not many practitioners of surrealism in his day. I think that kind of mode had passed well before him in a lot of respects. Yeah. I mean, maybe in Europe there are a couple more surrealists, but definitely not in America. There was no American surrealists at that point. But I think it's why it resonates is there's such a wonderful stew of not even ideologies, because the man was, you know, a defeatist and an idealist simultaneously, and they can shift one way or the other, scene to scene.
What do you mean by that? A defeatist and an idealist simultaneously?
Because if you watch something like, maybe not Blue Velvet, because Blue Velvet still has a very like hopeful ending, despite how dark that story is. But you look at something like Twin Peaks, where it's this kind of kooky thing and everybody's kind of really over the top and it's got these soap opera-ish elements. But then it can flip the next scene over to like this incredibly dark, seedy underbelly of it all. As if somebody who is acknowledging, and that's the thing with Lynch, where I think a lot of people thought for a while that he had lost touch or was full of shit, where they wanted the dark, edgy, like, yeah, man, the Burbs are really fucked up if you look closely. But yet, David Lynch, who was an Eagle Scout in his own right, I think he wanted to believe in the idealism of kind of 50s Americana and the Burbs and the promise that they gave. But yet he knew there was something dark under the surface. But he still wanted to believe, but he knew that. And like I said, those things almost kind of contrasted each other. They would play off of each other. They would go back and forth, like I said, sometimes scene to scene in some of his works.
So
and
he knew
I think that
the
was
cultural points to hit, but he also knew exactly how to subvert on those fronts too.
He knew how to subvert, but the subversion wasn't what you were. Even somebody who was expecting a subversion wouldn't see that coming. It's almost like, if you're expecting A or B, he would sometimes go A to Z and then back to like F and then G the next scene, but then C the next scene. Like he would keep you on your toes and you most of the time be like, what's going on? And Lynch would just be sitting there going, I ain't telling you shit. I know what's going on.
Exactly. And I was actually just going to say on those grounds, John, because I remember you and I talking a lot about, we kept using this phrase of, even when we don't know what's going on in a Lynch movie, which is a good lot of the time for most normal human beings, he feels like he knows how he's driving the bus and where, right? Even though we don't know what's going on, there's this very strong, overwhelming sense that Lynch himself does. And so we go with him. How do you qualify that in a filmmaker? How did he in a nutshell actually accomplish that? And just a little add on there, because we all as filmmakers want to make I was going to say content. We all want to make stories and narratives that are different, right? And intriguing. And we want to pull the audience in and hook them and catch them and relentlessly pull them into the next moment and then the next and then the next and spit them out at the end. And they think to themselves, wow, what a ride. Let's go again. I got so much out of that. I want to do it again and get so much out of it next time. Right. And we all have these little intuitions about how we want to do that in our own way. I want to do this. Well, it's not advised to do that. Well, I'm going to do it anyway. And then what happens? Oh, what do you know? It didn't work. But there's a sense in the Lynch films that that's not even in the realm of thinking. It's so personal and integrated into the style. So again, the question is, how did Lynch transcend that whole idea of even restricting yourself to the audience and being able to make the film in such a way where almost no matter what the choice is, forgetting fan base, I'm talking about the film itself, people following it because of what's the material inside the movie itself. How did he accomplish that and bring you excitingly into one moment and then the next and the next where you couldn't stop watching, no matter what he did?
Yeah, there's a number of things to unpack there. I would argue first and foremost, the main difference I see between Lynch and a lot of Lynch acolytes, or not even acolytes, I'd say imitators that I've seen, and other people who dabble in surrealism. The thing I always catch myself saying is, like we had said, I don't know what's going on here, but I trust that this guy knows what's going on. That was my experience watching Blue Velvet.
Which was your first Lynch film watch, right?
So,
which Adam and I were both in the room for.
I lied to you guys about that. I didn't realize I lied.
Oh, you wait till the podcast episode to tell us this?
That's
amazing.
Here's the context for that. So, it was my first Lynch feature. I forgot earlier that year I had watched another Lynch film, because that was 2020, where you know, that one thing happened. So I kind of forgot about a couple things I did before, March of 2020.
Okay. So what was
my
that first Lynch
my
film?
first Lynch film was actually the short film he did in 2017 called What Did Jack Do? And Netflix put it out in 2020.
Yeah.
So I got to see David Lynch acting and directing, and I remember watching this thinking, I don't know what the fuck is going on here, but it's a man interrogating a monkey over, I think, a murder. And I still haven't decoded it because I haven't seen it since, but if it's on Netflix, I might actually watch it again after this recording. But, I had that experience when I was watching Blue Velvet, which was, I don't know I'm not fully following what's going on here on a deeper level, but I understand at a gut level that the person who made this does.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to let you take me to where you're going. But when I've seen other films that try to dabble in Lynch as an imitator or something with surrealism, I don't get the same response. I feel like there's something a little more self-centered about it. I feel like there is, at least from a gut response, it feels more inwards. It feels more like this is my art. This is how I'm choosing to do it, and I don't care if you understand it.
So does that align at all with what you were saying about his personality of being very like mushy and sentimental and nice and open with his actors? Does that correspond with the personality, so to speak, of the film that you're seeing?
Yes, because with Lynch, I think Lynch respects those who watch his films. I think that's a core difference. I don't ever feel like when I'm watching a film, there's never this feeling that Lynch thought he was better than us. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when you watch something surreal, you can get into this kind of pretentious attitude. Sometimes it feels like, oh, this person's just doing this because they wanted to do it this way. Mm-hmm. And Lynch's films, like, for example, I watched Inland Empire last night for the first time. I really could not tell you if you asked me to describe what was going on, the most I could say is they tried making a movie. They were adapting a screenplay of a film that got made before that was cursed, and both actors died, and she's starting to become that character. Maybe. I think. But I was never frustrated watching it because there never felt like there was this air of superiority.
Or that air of like the director basically begging you to ask them what it means. Yeah. I have something here, and please ask me what it means because I have a whole explanation as to why. Right. Again, Lynch wouldn't tell you.
Right.
And that's the feeling I get with Lynch's films, is that there's this feeling of like, I believe in you. I believe that you will figure this out. And I think the other thing about Lynch's films that definitely makes him different than other people, mm-hmm. or other filmmakers rather, is when you look at arguably his most normal movie, although I haven't seen The Straight Story because I can't get my hands on it anywhere yet. But when you watch a film like The Elephant Man, it's a very normal film. It's a very straightforward film. It's one of the most beautiful films I have ever seen. Yeah. It is, besides two small sequences, a very traditional Hollywood studio production.
Right.
And you see the utter humanity and love that this person possesses in this film, and the way that he views humanity, and the way that he views people who are different than the norm.
Right.
And the other thing about that film is that it's a well-structured film. And when you look at his other films, no matter how outlandish they might appear on the surface, they follow a structure.
Yeah.
Out of all of Lynch's films that I have seen, there's not one where I feel like, he's just kind of making this up. And then he runs out of time and says, all right, we got to get to the end here.
Right. There's narrative momentum.
Yeah, there's narrative momentum. There is proof of some kind of structure. Now, I don't think that they all follow a 3-act structure from what I've seen, but I would argue Elephant Man, Blue Velvet, and Wild at Heart, those all follow a 3-act structure. And that is something that makes a film palatable to a person. And all of his films, in some capacity, have there is a general genre element to it. Or if not a genre element, there's something that is consumable to people. Elephant Man is a period drama. Blue Velvet is in some capacity, it's a thriller. Twin Peaks is a police procedural. Mulholland Drive is another sort of thriller in the scope of like that first half being some kind of investigative story.
Yeah.
Like
Wild at Heart was a romance movie.
Yeah. Wild at Heart is a romance movie and a road story. Like
and a road
Adam
movie.
said.
Yeah, road story, yeah.
And a heist film.
Yes.
Like these are not out there things. He's taking fairly consumable genres that an audience would want to see and then putting his twist on it.
Yeah.
And I think that goes a long way with audience goodwill. And he was really smart about that. I think he knew that if you worked within that convention, the audience would get it. And the audience would be more open to it. Even Dune's a science fiction film. And while Dune is more of a cult classic, like people still like it. Dune is science fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is Eraserhead. Eraserhead also would fall into science fiction as well, if you want to think about it.
Yeah, and from what I've heard, horror.
Yeah,
yes.
And it's funny because it's also, because I've been sitting here contemplating like his relationship to genre. You can argue like he's a very, obviously the 40s, 50s, influences on him. But you can argue he made 3 noir films. Blue Velvet can fall into noir. I think Lost Highway is definitely a noir film. And the argument can be made that Mulholland Drive is also very much a noir film.
Oh, yeah.
In a ton of respects.
Inland Empire is the only film of his that I've seen where I've said, okay, we're being a bit more... This is his most esoteric film that I've seen. Mm-hmm. Because I will admit, as a cardinal sin, I still have yet to see Eraserhead. But from what I've seen, Inland Empire is quite a bit more esoteric, and I'm trying to figure out what the structure of that film was.
Right. Well, at that point, it's so late in his experience and in his career. At that point, he's probably making something that's so personal and expressing himself in a different way even than he ever has before, which is a crazy thought.
It really did feel like a film that he was making for himself, because he also shot that on a camcorder. Which
he loved that.
Yeah, and I will have to say, as somebody who shoots as well, what got me was the proof that those things had like 2 stops of dynamic range or whatever it was. You blow your highlights, you are not getting them back. Right. But with good lighting, there's still some shots in that film that I thought, wow, this looks really good.
Yeah.
So there's something really interesting about that to me. But yeah, that really felt like his most, I'm doing this for me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, getting back to what makes Lynch Lynch, which is, we could do a 4-hour podcast trying to crack that very subject. Yeah. But I think if I were to boil that down all the way into one element, I would boil it down to the man had an emotional antenna.
Yeah.
And the reason that I'm saying that, using those words, is because Lynch was very much into, as some may know, transcendental meditation and meditation in general. Why? Because he was trying to help the world understand how he acquired and ascertained ideas, right? Filmmaking is about ideas. I have an idea, I write a movie around it, and then that's the movie, right? That's what he used to say, right? So the more ideas that you can muster, the more things that you can do on screen. So he was very much he described meditation or artists as having a sort of antenna, and you pick up the frequencies of the universe and of humanity and what everything means through that antenna, and you translate them into the signals into narrative sorts of ideas that end up on the screen. Not only did he have an antenna that was he was just very well equipped with that naturally, right? But he was able to translate not just into, colors and visual elements, but he was able to arrange everything in such a way where there's a very emotional idea being delivered unto us. It was almost like this kind of, I always felt it as, these big sounds, big images, bold, brash, flashes and characters, right? It's almost like he's just like assaulting you with the good word of the universe. There was almost something like prophetic about it, like he's giving it to you on the altar straight from like God that he was listening to through a can with a string attached to it. On the other end was God whispering these things into his ear. And because he had such emotional importance running through every single fiber of it, it came across that way. And it's like he knew no other way but to get the emotion into the thing. And that's, I think, to bring it back to The Elephant Man, which is in my like top 3. Mm-hmm. That is one of, John was saying something superlative about it. That is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen.
Yeah.
It is just abominably incredible filmmaking. But the reason for that is because it capitalizes on emotion almost perfectly in every moment. It's absolutely astonishing. It's riveting because of that. And John was saying earlier, which I completely agree with, Lynch had some sort of golden version of empathy for the other. And that's why it was never actually about him, I feel, with these movies. Even though they're so flashy and strange, it seems like it is, right? But I think that once you experience the emotion that the film gives you, you have to conclude at some point, after he just does this over and over again, that this is a man that is just so good at translating emotion to me. And I think I see that starting certainly with Eraserhead, because that was his own sort of feeling about his own insecurities, anxiety about being a parent, right? But he was able to translate that so clearly into how he felt about it, because he makes you feel the same. He might not have been literally fostering a deformed baby thing, but he was feeling the kind of anxiety that one would feel if they were. And so the only way to get that emotional signal across is for him to paint, quite literally, because he was a painter, as we know. He started out as a painter and painted his whole life, which the art of David Lynch, The Art Life, gets across very well, that documentary. The only way he was able to do that was to create a narrative where there's a character that is forced to foster a mutated, horribly deformed baby, right? And so, for me, seeing this man do the sort of reverse psychology arithmetic in his head of, I'm not just going to create images and then ideas will come from them. It was, no, this is the idea. This is the emotional idea that I'm getting from my antenna. It's the signal. And the people need to feel that. So I'm going to give the picture, the painting on screen of what that needs to be to initiate that response in the person. And that sounds very complicated, but that was what the man's talent was. Those neurons fired in his head and were able to do that. And guys, it's the kind of thing, I don't know about you, but for me as a filmmaker, if I can do a fraction of that kind of arithmetic in my head when I'm making movies or talking about movies for a second, I'll be happy. Let alone what this guy was able to do with any theme and emotional component that he felt he needed to get across to the viewers.
A question for the panel, because I'm going to fire back with something that was at the time looked as a misfire, but I think is one of his best films. Neither of you have watched Twin Peaks yet. I know, Andrew, you watched a few episodes, but
yeah, not in full.
Not in full. And John, you have not seen
I
Twin
have yet
Peaks
to see
either?
Twin Peaks.
So Twin Peaks is, inarguably, we can all agree, probably his most mainstream success. I mean, when I said David Lynch died to my
For
mother,
sure.
she's like, "Oh, Twin Peaks! I love Twin Peaks." Like she knew David Lynch through
My
Twin
mother
Peaks.
too.
Yeah.
Same
I
thing.
think my mom as well.
Yeah.
And yet, David Lynch was the guy that when he got to make a feature-length version of Twin Peaks. Now, Twin Peaks had ended on a cliffhanger, and of course, naturally, people were like, "All right, we thought season 2 got weird, but like maybe he'll just continue the story and he'll give us what we want." Instead, David Lynch did probably one of the most humanistic things a filmmaker could do. He made his film version of the TV show about the victim of the show, Laura Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who was supposed to just be essentially, and I hate to put it this way, and this is how we kind of view dead bodies and true crime stories sometimes, is a unique piece of art direction. She was a girl literally wrapped in plastic, and she's the opening image of the show, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he said, no, this is not just, a body wrapped in plastic. This was a person. And she was the emotional focal point of the show, even if she wasn't a character. So what did he do? He made this film that had a crossover appeal, and arguably the last chance he had a true crossover appeal, about the last week of this woman's life, and it was not an easy film to watch. And he gave that piece of art direction, as the audience saw it, a soul. He told a story for that person and gave her that characterization, and to the point where I think that's Laura Palmer's staying power as a character came from Firewalk with Me. And while people rejected that movie violently, it got booed at Cannes. That was the moment Tarantino disowned David Lynch, essentially, even though I have thoughts on that. I think Tarantino's full of shit, but that's neither here nor there. But he did. He literally took his biggest project and he's like, no, I can tell you the boring thing. We can do and you find out what happened next. No, I'm going to make you guys sit with the fact that you guys took this character for granted. And you're going to sit there in her last week and you're going to see her suffer throughout this entire film in this Job-like experience. There are filmmakers that are humanists, and then there are filmmakers that are humanists. And that was Lynch. Lynch took that decision, and that was not a popular decision, and he did that.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
I think it works under that same umbrella. It's that umbrella of, the I don't even want to use the word like good, because that goes into very subjectivity, that it's not quite accessible, but an artist that's effective, an artist that does work, that has some kind of a lasting effect, an indelible mark on the culture. And I think it always comes down to an artist that understands the emotional connection between themselves and their subject. Understanding the subject, because I was mentioning before that Eraserhead was about his own pain and anxiety. Yeah. Whereas, think about it, the second feature right after that, The Elephant Man, still a very young Lynch, 28, 29 years old. This is a movie for the first time that it was about expressing another human being's pain.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And then 8 or so years later, Blue Velvet. Again, writing a story about other people's pain, and yet in the context of a sort of small, kind of like northwestern kind of town, like the one that he grew up in Montana. So it's set there, but it's about feeling for the Isabella Rossellini character. That's what the entire movie rests on. And I think it's very rare that you find a filmmaker that truly understands that every moment, every image, every striking thing ultimately is painted with that brush, that emotional brush that needs to connect to the core emotional component of the movie.
It's truly Lynch is truly a marriage of unique and interesting visuals, but with the emotionality. He doesn't forget the emotionality.
Yes. Now, I want to go into real quick, guys, and I think I'm going to start with you on this, John.
Well, I just want to piggyback off of that real quick.
Oh, sure.
It's very brief.
Sure.
Kind of going back to your first question and tying into what you just said, I think you could get everything you need to know about David Lynch from one scene in The Elephant Man. And that's the scene where they read Romeo and Juliet.
Oh,
and
John, that scene
I remember
obliterates me.
I remember I cry every time I watch that scene. And
yeah,
there are so many layers to that scene. But yeah, I think in a sense he's acknowledging beauty, he's acknowledging tragedy, he's acknowledging all of these things, and it's just summed up with when she says, "You're no elephant, you're Romeo," and I think that's who the man was. This was a man who was willing to see the beauty and humanity in all of us, regardless of who we are and what our flaws or circumstances were.
Yeah. And that's a truly special person, no matter what their occupation is. You know, like those kinds of people, I think, have a shine to them that just lights up your soul and makes you believe in humanity, no matter what they do. I think this special kind of person that had that gift happened to be a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Thankfully, so that he could kind of preserve and trap his perspective on things in amber, on celluloid amber, and so that we could enjoy seeing how that is defined and realized, that concept that you just outlined there. I don't want to try and romanticize what we've been seeing in Lynch films in the way we are, even though it's easy to when you go that route as we just did. But let's talk about some fucked up stuff. because we could talk all day about how romantic Lynch really is and how he understands the other and he's empathic and he feels and all of this stuff, and all that is true. However, you can't shake off the fact that if you pluck any average Joe or Joan off of the street, you sit them down in a theater, you pry their eyes open in an Alex Delargian kind of way, and you show them Eraserhead, you show them Blue Velvet, you show them Wild at Heart, or any of these things. They're going to possibly try to ask you to erase their memory. And they're going to look back at you and say, well, we're not friends anymore. Have a great life. So, there are some things in these movies that are so detestable and off-putting, I think, by the mainstream eye, that, and I'm not arguing for, what's the purpose of this, but I'm arguing, why do you think that Lynch was so compelled to, and he's been asked this question a million times, and he has his own answers, but I'm talking about through your perspectives, knowing who he is, the kind of art that he made, the impact that it had on the culture. What compels David Lynch to employ such grotesquerie and off-puttedness into this work? And what was the function of it?
Yeah. So like I think Adam and I both said before, Lynch is a man who saw great beauty in people and places and the world. But I think Lynch, as I mentioned before, Lynch is also, you can tell he's pragmatic. And you can tell from one statement alone that he said, where he's talking about why he did commercials. He's famously done a commercial for Gucci. He's famously done a commercial for PlayStation. He's an artist. And granted, PlayStation was grading on a curve because the PlayStation commercials he did are bizarre.
Yes.
They paid David Lynch to do exactly what David Lynch was expected to deliver. So maybe that's grading on a curve, but nonetheless, many people would look at that as selling out. Are you doing it for Sony, a corporation? And it's like, yeah, because they pay me. Like he, probably made a quarter or $500,000 doing that PlayStation commercial.
Sure.
But knowing that alone, I think it also explains why there's so much darkness in his films as well. And it's because he's pragmatic. This is a man who understands the world. There is great beauty in the world. There are many people that are beautiful in this world and good and well-natured. But for every Gandhi, you get a Hitler.
Yeah.
The world is a beautiful place. The world is also at times a fucked up place.
Yeah.
And I see this as a man who knew that and knew that it would resonate with people. Like I said, I think that this is very mask off. He makes no concessions on the beauty that he sees in the world and the beauty that he sees in people, but he also makes no concessions about showing the utter darkness that's there. And also from a pragmatic stance myself, when you go that way, it's better writing. When you give your character something like a Frank Booth, it does push you further. But I think what's different is that, you could show somebody Blue Velvet and they might say, I don't think we're going to be friends anymore. But if you show somebody Irreversible, they're definitely not going to be friends with you anymore. And I think that's the difference.
Yeah.
Because from everything I've heard about Irreversible, or if the German version of Funny Games is the same as the American version, there is a sense of cruelty there in films like those as examples. And I'm not using that to attack Haneke or Gaspar Noé, but there is a brutality in certain films and a bleakness in certain films that make you say, aye, all right. But you don't get that in a film like Blue Velvet. You see a young man who wants to do the right thing. You see a woman who will do whatever it takes to get her child back. Yeah. And you see at the very end of the film that she genuinely loves her child. And there is a balance there. And I think a film like Mulholland Drive is a little more complicated because that's definitely a bleaker film. But I could see how a film like that is him expressing his own frustrations on the film industry at that time. But he still, in that first half, shows what could have been.
Sure.
And there are people who do live that. And it's not to say, oh, this was what Naomi Watts' character envisioned, and that's not attainable. It's no, there are people who live that experience in the industry.
Yeah.
And the bitterness comes from the jealousy that comes through, because somebody does get to have that, and that character didn't. Yeah, I think he chooses to show the bleakness of the world because the world can be bleak.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the world can be beautiful too. You can't get one without the other.
Yeah, that's sort of a message that is well delineated in Blue Velvet, and many of the others, of course. But he's very forward with that about Blue Velvet. Is there anything else that you want to add to that, Adam?
That was very well put. So I'll say this though, to kind of add a little bit onto it. David Lynch also has a very kind of childlike understanding of good and evil. Like, it's not for while the films themselves are kind of nuanced, the characters kind of aren't.
Childlike in a good way or a bad way?
In a good way. Again, you look at a character like Frank Booth. There is nothing redeemable about Frank. Not a single thing is redeemable about him. And yet, you look at a character like Sandy, she's just pure innocence in a lot of respects. I mean, Jeffrey is a little bit shades of gray, and I'm sure you can go down the line of his films and find characters that are a little bit shades of gray. But how the world in which Lynch builds and how it functions, there's good people and there's bad people, and sometimes really bad people on top of that. Mm. And I think the reason why he does choose to do the grotesqueness is to just elevate how terrible those bad people can be, to John's point. Showing that, there is great evil in the world, as kind of Jeffrey says when he's breaking down after he sees Frank brutalize Dorothy for the first time in Blue Velvet, and he's trying to rationalize it. And it's before Sandy gives her Robin speech. So I think that that's kind of why he chooses to do those grotesque things, is to show, to John's point, that the world can be kind of dark and cruel, but then he can also show the beauty of it, literally the next scene.
Right.
As it were. He kind of does that vacillating back and forth. And again, and that's something, because directing is all about tone management. And if you sometimes do those scenes back to back, it feels like it should be such a whiplash on paper. It's like, wait, you're telling me you're showing the worst thing you've ever seen, then the next scene is the best thing you've ever seen? That should not work. Mm-hmm. But yet, again, Lynch's confidence brings that into a landing so smoothly that, again, no other director could do that. The closest one is, because I was thinking about other like surrealists that were contemporaries of Lynch. The only one I can think of is Ken Russell. Is the only one I think comes close. And a very different filmmaker, though.
Yes, still very different. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Very British.
Very British. The other surrealists I thought of were British. One's technically American, that's Gilliam, but he's an expat and considers himself British.
Right. Sorry, what were you saying, John?
The only filmmaker I could think of that could be, and I haven't seen any of his other films yet, even though I think Criterion just put some of them on, so I'm going to try and give some of them a watch. I think Arrow has a few as well. This is a sponsored ad for Arrow and Criterion, by the way. That's a lie. They're not paying me, but I wish they'd pay me. But I love the service. I'm going to continue using it anyway. I'd be curious to see what the Japanese filmmaker Nobuhiko Obayashi does, because this is the director of House. Because House is the only other like surrealist film I can think of that has, like a cult to semi-mainstream appeal as more and more people get introduced to the film. That film, as we all know, and anybody who's listening, is that film is totally bonkers. But he was a very mainstream filmmaker in Japan. He was very famous. And he had a career in the commercial world before he did House. So I would be curious to see what his balance would be like, and if his films were more normal. Mm-hmm. Or like they had a surrealist element, but they were doing more straightforward films. Because House is this like kind of unique gem where it does follow a plot, as most horror movies do.
Right.
But it's a very surreal film.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, for sure. It's still interesting to compare this guy to other people, because there is something so distinctive, even among the most distinctive. It's wild. And one other surrealist, because we're talking about those that I would mention in this conversation, is Jan Švankmajer, who was the great Czech surrealist who made a lot of claymation and stop motion animation. Yeah. I think I showed one of his movies at one of my movie parties once, which was probably a little otique. He also did an amazing adaptation of Alice in Wonderland, and so many short films that are absolutely incredible. And he was able to weave idea webs in very interesting ways. But again, mostly using animation.
Yeah.
Lynch was not an animator at the end of the day. He started out wanting to really animate, which is very interesting. It's almost like he was an animator trapped in a filmmaker's body, because he started out with paintings and he said, wouldn't it be great if these paintings could move? And then he made these short films. The very first ones, like the alphabet and so on, were actual animations. But then he kind of grew out of that and said, no, wait, I want these things to be real. I want them to feel like they're real people. So he kind of combined the animation vibe and atmosphere with the actual live action medium, which is just so fascinating in and of itself when we're just talking about the medium with which he worked. So he's a combination of a lot of things and yet nothing. So, gentlemen, I want to be mindful of your time. You've already given us a lot of it, but I do have to wrap things up by asking you a quite obvious question, but I'm not embarrassed about it because I think it's a great way for us to show how we personally respond to this guy's work and just get to the quintessence of what it means to us. I have to ask each of you individually, what is your most memorable David Lynch moment? And I think I do mean by that watching one of the films. That's part A. And part B is, how does that moment factor in to what this guy means to you? I'm going to start so that you two have a second to think about what your own is. So, a few years ago, my brother got married. And for the wedding, a lot of family flew in. Okay? And there is a young cousin of mine. I believe it's a cousin or a nephew once removed or whatever. And 14 years old. And he loves movies. Different kinds of movies. Seen a lot of stuff, especially for a 14-year-old. Really involved and interested in art. And he had learned, I was living in New Jersey at the time, that I had this little home theater in my living room that you guys have been to a million times, and that I loved different kinds of movies, and he loved different kinds of movies, and I haven't seen him too much because he lives, in a different state, kind of far. So we decide that he's going to stay over my place for a night, and we're going to watch a movie. And he liked everything, horror, you name it. But it seemed to me that mostly he was interested in things that were just different and vibey and interesting. Okay? So I chose, and I knew that he could handle it, I believed, because of other titles that I heard from his father that he had seen, right? So he comes over, I pop in a little movie called Eraserhead. And I chose this movie. I chose this movie. I know you haven't seen it yet, John. You have, Adam, but I chose this movie because I thought, you know what? If I'm going to choose one, I get one for this kid to see and really remember the experience. Because I knew I probably wasn't going to see this cousin of mine for a long time, and I haven't seen him for a while, even though I've kept a little in touch with him. And the movie plays. The movie plays well. Because even though it was just the two of us, I was watching him kind of carefully, and the whole movie, first of all, it was a beautiful Blu-ray of Criterion, which I hadn't screened in full yet. So I was dazzled because of the new transfer. It was absolutely incredible on my big screen and the surround sound. But he just sort of shrank back into the couch. Not in a bad way. There was intrigue, but there was a clear emotional response constantly walloping this kid. And again, not in a way that he wasn't able to handle it. It was just obvious that he had never frickin' seen anything like this before. This was the first Lynch movie, blah, blah, blah. The movie ends. The credits roll. I look over at my cousin, who I hadn't looked at in a bunch of minutes because I was enthralled with the ending, and I always am. My cousin was like this. For those of you that are listening on audio, I am covering my mouth with both of my hands, sinking back into my chair. My eyeballs are popping out of my skull. And I let the credits roll and run through their entirety. And my cousin just keeps that stance, you know? It was just, I was almost watching myself watch the movie for the first time, because it reminded me of when I watched it when I was like 15 or 16, I believe I was. Almost the same age. And it just gave me this idea that it doesn't matter what time period we're in. It doesn't matter who it is, although it really shouldn't be shown to kids that are too young, right? You know, where you come from. You watch this film and you are absolutely a prisoner to the emotional response that is impending on you. And that it is my favorite Lynch moment of all time, because not only did I ask my cousin what they thought, and they said, first of all, he said, I'm processing, but it was incredible. Incredible. And not only that, but my cousin changed his Facebook profile picture to the head of the Eraserhead baby. And I believe it's still that ever since that night. So I haven't had a full-blown conversation with him since about this specifically, but I believe, especially after he listens to this, I'm sure he's going to talk to me about it again. I believe that had one of the most emotional and visceral impacts on him in his life. And there is something unbelievably important to be said about a filmmaker that is able to do that to anyone.
That rips. That story rips so hard. That is like goated uncle energy there. Or no, you said cousin, right?
Cousin.
Yeah,
That's
it's either uncle or cousin, whatever. Regardless, I am the psychotic, crazy family member that showed the 14-year-old, family member the thing.
Nah, man,
his father loved it though. His father was like, Eraserhead, I love that movie.
Yeah, dude, that's coolest family member shit right there. That's that's fucking awesome.
It's all due to Lynch, not me.
Yeah.
I just hit the play button,
I'll give you two. I'll give you one that's just a scene of itself, and I'll give you a personal story that I have that, Andrew, you're actually kind of involved in, so you can kind of piggyback off of it.
I didn't do it, I swear. Sorry. Please go on.
So the first is going to be a scene from Twin Peaks: The Return, in which Lynch himself actually acted across from David Duchovny, who was playing a trans FBI agent named Denise. And John was talking a lot about mask off moments, and I think that this scene is, helped by the fact that Lynch himself is in it. But what I like to think of as Lynch as a guy, and I'm not going to give the whole monologue because I can't sustain my Lynch, but I think this sums up the man. I think it sums up his work perfectly. So Denise and Gordon, David Lynch's character, are going back and forth about their history. And at the end of this long speech, Lynch goes, "And when you became Denise, I told your colleagues, those clown comics, to fix their hearts or die." And I think that phrase, "fix their hearts or die," has become something of a rallying cry of a lot of people these days. And I think when I think of David Lynch, I think of that scene. I've watched that scene a bunch since he's passed. The other thing I think of with David Lynch was a making of documentary or an interview off the Mulholland Drive Blu-ray, where it's David and Naomi Watts talking about the masturbation scene in Mulholland Drive. And Naomi Watts has the best David Lynch impression I've ever heard, at all. and she's going through the story, and there's a moment that whenever I hear her voice or her saying this, kind of comforts me to an extent. So flash forward a bit, I'm about to go to a screening that John, you were at, that one of my movies are going to be showing at, and we were running late, and I was very stressed. And I reach out my phone, and I text Andrew. I say, Andrew, don't ask me questions, but I need you to call me up in about 5 minutes' time, and I need you to say this exact quote to me, because it'll calm me down. And lo and behold, Andrew gives me a call 5 minutes later, and he goes, "It's okay, Naomi, we're going to get through this together." And every time I hear that, just not even David Lynch saying, but Naomi Watts imitating David Lynch saying, "It's okay, Naomi, we're going to get through this together," it instantly just makes me calm. Because again, it's almost like, it's like your grandfather putting his hand on your shoulder and saying, "It's okay, kid, everything's going to be fine. We're just going to sweep up this mess, and Dad won't even know you broke the vase."
Yeah.
And those two things are what I think about when I think of David Lynch.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
John, so what say you? What is the most impactful, memorable Lynch watching or Lynchian experience for you?
Yeah, it's the ending to Blue Velvet the first time I saw it with you guys. Because I think you guys both remember, and I think Andrew, you talked about it with Stonehouse on the Blue Velvet episode, where you get to the end of this film and this journey that these characters have been on, and I just remember getting very emotional for a variety of reasons. And I don't know if it was partly because it was the middle of the pandemic and we didn't have any idea like what the fuck was going to happen, because I think this was about June. It was like end of June or early July, and we still just like I said, we had just no idea what the fuck was going on. And we get through this really dark journey, and there was something about it where I certainly identified with Kyle MacLachlan's character, that you go through this really dark period. And I know at that point I was starting to get really depressed. Like I didn't tell people, it was bad. And there was just something about that where you get through this darkness and you see that things are going to be okay. Things are going to be all right. And I couldn't articulate that at the time. I didn't know why. Why I was so emotional at that period. But after I'd watched Blue Velvet again and had reflected on that, I knew that was why. I think that there was just something that was so impactful about that. And the other thing about the ending to Blue Velvet, watching it the first time, and under those circumstances or not, I just remember thinking, this is a really special person. There is something really, really special about the humanity behind the guy who made this film, because this is a dark movie. But there's something really beautiful about it too. And there's something really beautiful about the good of the good characters in this story. And that was what made me a Lynch fan. I'd seen What Did Jack Do, and I really enjoyed it, but it was that experience watching Blue Velvet that really, there isn't a moment that I think is going to top that for Lynch for me.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate you sharing that with us, because it's almost like you obviously don't need to get into that much detail, but I think the fact that you do is just a testament to what this guy is to us, and just the value of a person that's able to make such an impact on someone.
Yeah.
There are figures in popular culture or in life in general, I feel like they've always been here. Like whether that be John Fogerty in music, in a lot of respects, in the music of Creedence Clearwater Revival, whether that be, you know, certain gigantic figures of their time, they always just feel like they've been there. And David Lynch is somebody who always feels like no matter what, he's always been here. And the thing that I've been kind of grappling with since he's passed is he's not here anymore. He's not out in the wilderness somewhere doing some odd, weird kind of, you know, character study or a painting even, or work on a new show or new commercials or anything. And I told this to Andrew when he first passed, was if I was ever going to teach a film course, the first thing I would do is I'd show Blue Velvet. Just completely out of context, not to teach anybody anything about filmmaking or narrative structure or anything of the sort, but just to let my students kind of soak it in. And then once the film's over and the lights come back on, I'd point to the screen and I'd say, that guy did it by being himself. None of you in this room have the excuse. I'm not saying that's the right way or the wrong way or what any other professor's going to say, but he did it being him. Your most important thing that you have as an artist is your voice. So if you take away anything from this film or from David Lynch's career, find your voice and you'll be golden.
You know, I just have to say, to wrap this thing up for everyone, is that there's something that's very special in and of itself about talking about and appreciating your predecessors, you know, those that came before you. And I talk about that with these guys and all my friends and film colleagues all the time. You know, we constantly are standing on the shoulders of giants. Mm-hmm. And there's something about the fact that when John or my cousin or anyone else watches one of these movies, David Lynch doesn't have to be alive in the world for that film to do its work. In that way, I think that Lynch is absolutely immortal. And it's just a shame that we don't get to have him anymore in the physical world. But what we do have is these magnificent, one-of-a-kind creations that will extend that hand out to us in whatever way he wants to do, whether he wants to slap us across the face or extend a nice caress, because at any moment you can get either of those in one of these movies. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is that Grandpa David is there always. And whenever you want to get that wisdom, just turn the TV on, turn on the screen, press play, and behold. David, we love you. We miss you already. And I know I speak for everyone at this panel. I certainly do miss you so much. But I do hope that this gives listeners just a little bit of a hint of just how special you were, and be able to watch your films over and over again and continue to get so much out of them. Because in that way, you are immortal, and we thank you